Hello and welcome to the top Hearthstone cards of the week, where we look at the top cards from the r/custom Hearthstone subreddit. I'm your host, Samuel L. Jackson, and if you would like to submit your custom Hearthstone cards, you can tweet me or email me at thcwsubmissions@gmail.com. My Twitter and email are both listed down below. First up, we have Corpse Explosion, the 2-mana hunter secret that reads, when a friendly minion is destroyed, deal its attack damage to all enemy minions. So right away, a good comparison is the Warlock card Shadow Flame. Decks like Reno Warlock in the last expansion used Shadow Flame, and it's generally a good, relatively cheap, but highly situational board clear for the Warlock control decks. Now the big difference between Shadow Flame and Corpse Explosion is that this card is out of your control. Secrets can only be activated on your opponent's turn, so even if you put a minion out there on purpose, like Magma Rager, your opponent doesn't need to kill any of your minions if they don't want to. It's cutting the cost of Shadow Flame in half, but it's taking away your control over the situation. But let's say you have an intimidating board. Your opponent's going to need to clear your minions eventually, and the first minion of yours they do kill will activate the secret. Hunter already has a board clear secret and Explosive Trap, which deals 2 damage to all enemies, including your opponent's hero. But if you play the correct minion with this card, Corpse Explosion should deal upwards of 3 or more damage to the enemy board, making it a better secret than Explosive Trap. Next expansion's Hunter Hero card even has a board clear battle cry, so Blizzard is definitely making cards for more of a controlling hunter that this secret should fit into. Design-wise, I think this card is fine. I like how the minion your opponent chooses to kill will determine how valuable the secret is. So like all good secrets, your opponent can play around this card to make it weaker, or they can misplay and the secret can swing the game in your favor, but it's all dependent on your opponent's knowledge and skill of the game. With every secret printed, that class's secrets get better because your opponent will have to test and play around more interactions. So if Control Hunter becomes a thing, and secrets are included in that Control Hunter, this would definitely be a card to run. In aggro, your opponent could ignore your minions to prevent the secret from going off, but if you get a top minion in the way, it'll most likely be able to clear your opponent's low health minions before they deal any more damage. Your imagination can run wild with this card, from your opponent pint-sizing your minions to make the secret useless, or getting the secret to deal 10 damage to your opponent's boards with Ticking Abomination. But on average, this card would be a relatively good and cheap board clear. Next up, we have Fanatic Sacrificer, 4 mana 6/7 with the battle cry, destroy the next minion you play. So the idea is that you get the high stats for cheap, but at the cost of your next minion. Now this card is playing homage to the 4 mana 7/7 reach, but replaces the 2 mana overload with the cost of destroying a minion. This card works well with cheap death rattles, where you spend a little mana and you don't necessarily get the minion stats, but you at least get the death rattle effect. Of course, the best synergy is with the eggs, which actually want to be destroyed, so that they'll spawn a higher statted card on the cheap. But this will be a niche situation that only can work if you have this 2-card combo. Most of the time you'll have to play minion after this, and you'll spend 1 or 2 mana playing a small minion and destroying most of the value of that card in your hand. Even if you get the battle cry or death rattle effect of this destroyed card, you're still losing value in your overall deck. This is definitely a mid-range deck kind of card. It doesn't work well in aggro because destroying a minion of yours before you get to attack with it is pretty bad. And it doesn't really work in control because you destroy a good chunk of value of a card in your deck when you play a minion that gets destroyed right away. I like the design of the eggs, and if Blizzard continues to print minions that are meant to be destroyed, I think this card could fit nicely in a deck that surrounds the interaction. If you think about it, Silence Priest was a laughable deck concept for a while, with Purify getting a major backlash in the community, but in Angora it was actually a tier 1 deck there for a little bit, and it's still a viable deck to get legend. I think right now the destroying decks or the egg decks just aren't there to support this card, but I think Fanatic Sacrificer is exactly what a deck that revolves around destroying your own minions would need. Next up is Elemental, or Elemental, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. 3 mana 2/3 legendary neutral elemental with the card text, whenever a friendly elemental dies, return it to your hand instead. So the elemental race was introduced into Hearthstone in the most recent Angora expansion, with a lot of new elemental minions in priest, shaman, and mage, as well as neutral. In addition, they changed previous cards from just minions to elementals, and in the next expansion they are continuing to print cards that will work in elemental decks. With all of this, elementals still really haven't shined yet, and I don't think Team 5 expected them to this early in the rotation. To play an elemental deck, you want to be able to play an elemental every turn so that you can get the reward for playing an elemental the previous turn. But the problem is right now you can only fill your deck with like 10 good elementals. And so to keep the elemental streak alive, you can add some bad elementals, and when you add bad cards to your deck, it makes your deck pretty bad. It seems as though Team 5 will continue to make good and bad cards for elemental decks until there are enough good elementals to justify a deck. What this card, Elemental, does is, at the moment, the rewards for playing Elementals, cards that benefit from playing an Elemental last turn, will be able to get more value. So Stone Sentinel, Kalamos, Servant of Kalamos, all of these cards, if they die with this on board, you'll get double the value. I think Elementals need to get to a point where if you can't get this card to work on one Elemental, you have a few other options as strong Elementals in your deck that can still give you a lot of value. I think Team 5 kind of made a mistake with Jade in that it's just a simplified version of Elementals. Because for Jade, it doesn't really matter when you play them in the game, you just need to play all the Jade cards you can, and then fill the rest of your deck with good cards around them. I think Elemental decks have that similar tempo style to Jade, in that you need to gradually build up the value into a mid-range or controlled deck. Where Elementals differs that they require you to constantly play them to get this value. I think if Team 5 makes Elementals a quicker deck, a deck that can ramp up just slightly better than that of an average Jade deck, where because the player strung Elemental after Elemental, it was able to get that value earlier than a Jade deck would. It's very likely that Elementals, as we go on in the expansion, will get more powerful cards, but I don't necessarily want Elementals to be more powerful than Jade. I just want them to be a good counter to Jade. I want Elemental decks to be a mid-range deck that can rely on piecing plays together to get ahead in the value quicker, and this card can help do that. It's also a legendary, which is important because you can only have one per deck, but my ideal Elemental deck aside, I am a little bit scared at the moment of this being used with Lyra. Next up we have Oh It's Trash, 6 mana Warlock spell. Move an enemy minion from your board to your hand, then discard it. It's a similar hard removal to Siphon Soul, costing the same, which is pretty expensive hard removal, but a card that would see play in most control Warlock decks. First of all, this means the card isn't destroyed like Siphon Soul destroys a minion. It reacts more like Entomb, where the minion is just snatched from the board. This means if you trashed Tyrion, your opponent wouldn't get the weapon because the death rattle wouldn't actually be in effect because the minion actually never died. No one would get the weapon, the card would just be discarded from your hand. Speaking of discard, of course, every top Hearthstone cards of the week has to feature a card that tries to make discard quest work, and this week is no exception. But I think this discard spell especially works well with cards like Malchezaar's Imp, where now you have 6 mana, destroy an enemy minion, get a free discard, and draw a card. Also, this card has a really cool interaction with Cruel Dinomancer, whose death rattle could summon your opponent's minion you threw in the trash. In my opinion, Entomb wasn't a well-designed card. Playing against it, you kind of just had to accept that it was going to take one of your more powerful minions. It was just a better version of Mind Control, because it was so much cheaper, and basically it was kind of a predictable card that over the time of its cycle it became kind of boring. But Oh It's Trash improves on the idea of removing an enemy minion, but instead of being better in the late game, it's just better initially, synergizing more with the Warlock discard decks in addition to removing your opponent's minion. I am concerned that maybe it's this removal tech part of the card that I didn't like about Entomb, and maybe that being in use in this card would cause some trouble in terms of predictability or just overall not being a fun mechanic. Maybe that's why Team 5 hasn't printed a card like it since, but I'd like to know what you think about the whole removing tech. Also, if you liked Entomb, or you think this card is a better fit for the game. And at the number 1 spot we have Cipher the Bounty Hunter, 4 mana 3/3 neutral legendary with the battle cry. Discover a minion from your opponent's deck or hand and put a wanted card of it in your hand. So like any discover card, you pick from 3 options, and shown here are the examples of some wanted spells. If your opponent is running a Tar Creeper, Aya, and Tiny Fin, you can choose one of these 2 mana spells that will draw you 2 cards and destroy that minion specifically. Well, first let's focus on the destroy ability. It's a slow card, and the poor early stats are supposed to be made up for later in the game. When you play the wanted minion, hopefully you'll be able to pick a valuable minion from your opponent's deck. Once the minion is out in the field on your turn, you'll be able to destroy their costly minion for a cheap price. And this will allow you to play more cards that turn and swing the board in your favor. Now, the likelihood that you will discover a powerful or expensive minion all depends on your opponent's deck. But against a control deck, there's a good chance you'll discover one of their cards worth the 2 mana hard removal. Of course, the card also shows 3 of the minions your opponent is playing, so that's just a bonus bit of information to what deck you're playing against. But wait there, because I do have a problem with this wanted card. Looking at how the wanted card is written, I would think that after receiving the wanted card, I'm able to play it whenever I want. and this means that I could use it just to draw the 2 cards even if I don't intend on destroying the minion. This means I could put Cipher into an aggro deck, play this on turn 4, eventually when I run out of cards, I could just use the effect to draw 2 cards for 2 mana. A 4 mana 3/3 isn't aggro built stats, but being able to draw 2 cards for cheap is worth the 3/3 stats. The destroy mechanic is great, but being able to extort the wanted card for the 2 mana 2 draw card is not okay. I think this card should work how a wanted signs rewards would work. You have to do the job before you get paid. You should only be able to draw the 2 cards when you destroy the minion you've selected. One way you could do this would be to have the card not be playable until that minion is on board. I don't really like this idea because I think you should always be able to get rid of cards if you have the mana, but I think this card shouldn't draw the 2 cards unless you destroy that minion selected. Otherwise, if you play, it's just a 2 mana spell that does nothing. This emphasizes that the card is a long-term big swing play as opposed to just ways to draw cards. It's a really cool design. I like the idea that you're taking a risk with the bad stats and the discovering mechanic in the beginning in order to try to set yourself up later in the game to make a big play. I am a little bit worried about what it would be like to play against this card. Is it necessarily fair that your opponent can ruin your combo or destroy one of your most powerful cards just because it showed up in a discovery slot? You'll have to let me know. Now it's time for this week's viewer submission by Shiogorath, and they submitted the Butcher, 40 mana 10/10 Druid Legendary with Taunt. So if you look at this card, you can say, let's say by turn 10, you and your opponent have each played 10 minions, and they've all died. This means the card would cost 20, and these are of course just estimates. Now by turn 15, let's say 30 minions died. It's 10 mana, 10/10, destroy 2 minions. That's a pretty good card. But going in turn after turn, this card is going to become pretty insane. I'd say on average, again, I'm pulling this information out of nowhere, most decks probably play around 20 to 25 minions, and the rest are spells. In addition, control decks can add minions to their deck, and a lot of spells summon minions. So games can kill 40 minions relatively quickly, making this a 0 mana 10/10 with Taunt that destroys 2 minions later in the game. But let's say you're playing like a freeze mage who only has 10 minions. It's going to be harder to get this value, and maybe you won't even be able to play this card until the end of the game for around 10 mana. I love cards that are costed a bunch and need the game to go a certain way before it can even be played. I think being able to run only one of these is pretty important to the deck, but I think the battle cry of destroying 2 minions, especially in a late game situation, might be a little bit too overpowered. So I'd bring it down to destroy 1 minion, and I think that would maybe make this card a little bit more balanced. Where this card makes me shit my pants is in Jade decks, where they already spawn so many minions and have an unlimited late game value plan. So when you add a super late game 0 mana 10/10 with hard removal, God help us. Thank you for the submission, Shiogorath, and don't forget you can submit your custom cards by tweeting me or sending me an email at thcwsubmission@gmail.com. All the information is in the description. Thank you for watching the top Hearthstone cards of the week. I've been your host, and until next time.